Tulsa, Oklahoma, October 1985. Julia Carter was a criminal defense attorney, 36 years old, a mother, a neighbor, a woman whose life was built on order and routine. On Friday night, October 18th, she was home at 726 East Pine Street, a modest house just a short drive from the Arkansas River. Her son Caleb, only 11, went to bed upstairs. The porch light stayed on. The front door was locked. By morning, Julia was gone. Her Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme vanished with her. The boy came downstairs at 7:10 a.m., expecting to see his mother making breakfast. Instead, he found an empty kitchen. He called his aunt, terrified. When police arrived, they found no forced entry, no sign of a struggle inside the home. Only faint tire marks in the damp alley behind the property. News of her disappearance spread quickly. A lawyer vanishes overnight, her child left behind. Local headlines carried a simple question: where did Julia Carter go? Detectives built their first theories around her personal life. They pressed her boyfriend, Mark Bennett, who had been away in Dallas that night. They questioned her colleague, Assistant Prosecutor Tom Reed, rumored to be close to her outside the courthouse. Both men denied involvement, but suspicion followed them for decades. For 20 years, the file sat in storage, with little more than gossip keeping the case alive. Each October, a small note appeared in the paper's Unsolved column. Her son grew up under a cloud of whispers. Her mother kept a memorial in her home, never letting the city forget. The truth was buried, not in the courthouse or in the relationships everyone suspected, but in the water. It would take a rusted car frame, a crumpled parking ticket, and an old ledger to reveal what really happened that night. And when it did, it cleared two innocent men and pointed to someone nobody had imagined. This is the story of Julia Carter's disappearance. Stay with us as we go back to who she was, the life she lived, and the night she vanished. And share your thoughts. What do you think the first investigators missed in 1985? Julia May Carter was born
at home. Life was different. Julia lived at 726 East Pine Street, in a quiet residential neighborhood about 2 miles from the Arkansas River. The house was modest but well kept, a place where she raised her only child, 11-year-old Caleb. She had divorced in 1982 and fought for custody, winning full responsibility for her son. For Julia, balancing motherhood and a demanding legal career was never easy, but she made it work. Family and friends described her in simple, consistent terms. At work, she was disciplined, sharp, and prepared for every argument. At home, she softened, becoming gentle and patient with her boy. Caleb remembered her as the kind of mother who always made sure he had breakfast before school and checked his homework at night. Neighbors said Julia was polite but private, not one to gossip, but always dependable. Her appearance was distinctive enough that people remembered her clearly. She stood 5'6", with brown hair and hazel eyes. She always wore the same turquoise pendant, a piece passed down from her mother. It became her signature, the small detail people often mentioned first when describing her. Julia's daily routine rarely changed. She dropped Caleb off at school in the morning before driving to the courthouse. Most days stretched late into the evening, but she carved out time to jog at Owen Park or along the river trail before coming home. It was the kind of steady rhythm that gave investigators, years later, an important point. Julia was predictable. Her life was orderly. She wasn't someone who vanished on a whim. Her finances reflected that same stability. She carried no major debt, kept her bills current, and even managed to set aside a modest savings. Investigators later noted this, ruling out money troubles as a motive for leaving Tulsa. Nothing in her accounts suggested sudden spending or secret plans. The night before she disappeared, Julia had clear obligations waiting for her. She was scheduled to meet a client at the courthouse on Saturday morning, October 19th. It was routine work, but it was written in her calendar and noted by colleagues. She was also expected to join her sister for brunch on Sunday, a plan she confirmed over the phone. In her personal life, Julia was in a relationship with Mark Bennett, a 38-year-old civil project manager. They had been dating for nearly a year and were seen often together around Tulsa. To outsiders, it looked like a stable relationship. But neighbors remembered hearing arguments in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Most of it centered on whether they would move in together and how soon marriage might happen. Police would later focus heavily on Mark because of those arguments, but at this stage, he was simply the man Julia was seeing, the person most people assumed would eventually become her husband. Looking at the whole picture in 1985, Julia's life appeared stable. She had a secure job, a steady home, a child she loved, and a relationship moving forward, even if imperfect. She had no travel plans, had left behind no letters or notes, and had not made any preparations that suggested she wanted to leave Tulsa. She was tied to her home, her work, and her family. Everything in her life pointed to continuity, not disappearance. That is why her case struck so many people so deeply. When someone like Julia vanishes, it challenges the basic assumption that people with stable lives do not simply disappear. The locked front door, the porch light left on, her child asleep upstairs, all of it showed a woman still in the middle of her routine. Nothing about her life suggested she was planning an escape. And yet, within hours, Julia Carter was gone. By Saturday morning, her son woke up to find his mother missing, her car missing, and no explanation in sight. For police, the first reports described only a missing person, a case with no clear signs of foul play. But those who knew Julia disagreed. They believed immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. Her profile, so carefully built over years, became the foundation for investigators. It was the measure they would return to again and again. A disciplined lawyer, a devoted mother, a predictable routine. No debts, no sudden plans, no signs of stress. Friday night, October 18th, 1985, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Julia May Carter, 36 years old, was home with her 11-year-old son Caleb. Her boyfriend, Mark Bennett, was away in Dallas on a business trip. The house on East Pine Street looked quiet and safe. The porch light glowed, the front door was locked, and upstairs a child was asleep. Nothing suggested that this would be the night Julia disappeared. At 8:27 p.m., Julia made a phone call to her sister. She confirmed a brunch planned for Sunday morning. Her voice was calm, steady, and ordinary. There was no sign of distress, no hint that something unusual was about to happen. That call would be the last time any family member heard from her. Investigators later uncovered another phone record, one that would puzzle them for decades. At 8:15 p.m., 12 minutes before Julia spoke to her sister, the line at her home received a brief call from a payphone. It lasted only seconds. No one could confirm who placed it or why. At the time, detectives did not pursue it. Years later, it would resurface as a critical detail. By 9:03 p.m., a neighbor across the street heard the sound of an engine turning over. The headlights of Julia's Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme lit up the driveway. The neighbor assumed Julia was heading out for a late errand, but no one actually saw her inside the car. It was a sound and a glow in the dark, evidence without confirmation. Around the same moment, another neighbor reported something stranger. At roughly 9:05 p.m., they saw a man standing near the back fence of Julia's property. He wore a cap pulled low, his figure partly hidden in the shadows. The witness could not describe his face or clothes clearly. Police dismissed the sighting as vague, but the timing matched the moment her car came to life. At 9:20 p.m., the house itself still looked undisturbed. The porch light was on, the front door locked from the inside. Upstairs, Caleb remained asleep. He would later tell investigators he heard nothing unusual that night. No footsteps, no voices, no doors closing. It was as if his mother simply vanished into the dark without sound. Sometime around 10 p.m., yet another sighting surfaced. A driver passing near North Denver Avenue and Archer Street saw a light-colored coupe moving through the intersection. The description fit Julia's car, but the driver could not make out the license plate. That location was only a few miles from her home, a straight line toward the Arkansas River. The next morning, October 19th, everything fell apart. At 7:10 a.m., Caleb woke, came downstairs, and found the house empty. His mother was gone. Her bed was untouched from the night before, her purse missing, and the car nowhere in sight. The boy panicked and phoned his aunt. Within an hour, relatives were at the house, followed by Tulsa police. Detectives inspected the property. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no damage to the locks. Furniture was undisturbed, valuables left in place. The kitchen table held plates from dinner the night before. To police, it did not look like a struggle had happened inside. Behind the house, officers found something more subtle. On the dirt alleyway, faint tire impressions stretched across the surface. They matched the width of Julia's Oldsmobile. But the tracks were not sharp enough to prove direction or identify another vehicle. It was the only physical sign that a car had left the property that night. Because there was no blood, no forced entry, and no immediate evidence of foul play, the first report filed listed the case simply as a missing person. Missing person, no signs of foul play at residence. That line would later be criticized as one of the first missteps in the investigation. In the first hours, officers treated the case cautiously. They considered possibilities: that Julia had left voluntarily, that she had been called away suddenly, or that she might have been meeting someone she knew. Yet family and friends rejected that idea immediately. Witness statements created more questions than answers. The neighbor who heard the engine never saw Julia. The witness who described a man in a cap could not identify him. The driver who saw the coupe near Denver Avenue gave no details beyond color. Each account suggested movement, but none tied Julia directly to the vehicle after 8:27 p.m. The police canvassed the neighborhood through the morning. They asked about arguments, visitors, suspicious vehicles. Some remembered hearing a muffled conversation outside around 9 o'clock, but could not say if Julia was involved. Others recalled seeing a van parked near the corner earlier that evening. No one thought much of it at the time. By late morning, police expanded their search radius. Yet on that first day, they made one critical omission. They did not send units to Riverview, Marina, less than 3 miles away, where the Arkansas River curved against the edge of town. They focused instead on roadways, parks, and wooded areas. The river, and the boat ramps along it, would remain unchecked. That oversight would bury the truth for 2 decades. For Caleb, the morning of October 19th was the beginning of years of silence and suspicion. For investigators, it was the start of a case that looked ordinary at first, an adult disappearance without clear evidence of crime. And for Julia Carter, it marked the last confirmed trace of her life, a night of small details that would later grow into a puzzle spanning 25 years. The timeline was short and deceptively simple. A phone call to a sister, a payphone record, an engine at 9:03, a shadowed man, and a coupe on Denver Avenue. A locked house, a sleeping child, a car that never came back. But from that night onward, every search, every interview, and every headline would circle back to the same unanswered question. What happened to Julia Carter between the glow of her porch light and the silence of dawn? At 8:40 a.m. on Saturday, October 19, 1985, Tulsa police opened a missing person case for Julia Carter and put boots on the ground at 726 East Pine Street. The order was simple: start close, spread fast. Officers marked off a 10-mile radius around the house and pushed patrols toward the big corridors, US 75, I-244, and Admiral Place. The map of North Tulsa was broken into grids. Teams were assigned blocks. Inside the house, the front door was locked from the inside. No broken glass, no pried jams. The rooms were tidy, coffee mugs, books, the normal Friday night. In the back alley, faint tire marks cut across damp soil. The scene tech snapped photos but didn't cast the tracks. A light shower rolled in that evening and blurred the impressions. When investigators later tried to match the Oldsmobile's tires, the marks were too soft to compare. One small miss, and a possible path out of the alley was gone. Phone records from the home line showed a short call at 8:15 p.m. the night before. A payphone call. It was written down in a notebook and underlined. That was it. No immediate trace request to the phone company. No canvas of corner stores to ask who used which booths. The thinking, again, was that Julia may have stepped out, or called someone back, or left briefly. When hours turned into a day, the lead evaporated. Maintenance logs that might have listed booth locations and service visits were never pulled. By the time anyone asked, paperwork had moved, managers had retired, memories had faded. Officers canvassed the block. The first ring of neighbors gave two usable statements. One person said they heard a car start at 9:03 p.m. and saw headlights sweep the driveway. They couldn't see who was in the car. Another neighbor mentioned a man in a cap near the back fence sometime between 9:05 and 9:20. That note was stamped, too vague. No composite sketch was made. No follow-up photo lineups. The witness wasn't re-interviewed until the case reopened decades later, when the details had become soft around the edges. A second tip came in from a pedestrian who reported a light-colored coupe near North Denver Avenue and Archer Street around 9:15 p.m. The location sits a few miles from Pine Street. The report was filed, time-stamped, and stored. Officers did not stage a route study from the house to that corner. They did not check nearby lots for fresh mud or unusual tire tracks. It was a small choice in a long list of small choices. Search teams worked the obvious parks, Owen Park, and the residential strips nearby. They checked cul-de-sacs and roadside pull-offs. Video wasn't much help. In 1985, few lots had cameras, and city traffic footage wasn't archived the way it is today. Even so, the team did not ask private lots or marinas for receipts or handwritten ledgers from the night before. No one called boat storage yards to ask about late cash transactions. No one reached out to towing or auto glass shops for unusual after-hours work. If someone moved a car at night, a tow strap or a winch could have done it. But there was no bulletin to those shops. No knock-and-talks to owners. The white van that would someday change everything stayed anonymous. Back at the house, the story hard set. The case title read, "Missing Person, No Indication of Foul Play at Residence." The emphasis fell on no indication. That single phrase did real damage. It made the first 72 hours feel less urgent. It nudged the search toward routine highways instead of high-risk sites. It kept the team from pushing for a helicopter, a boat, or even a volunteer dive look at the ramp. Officers did what the label asked for, a missing person sweep. What they did not do was treat the water as a crime scene waiting to be found. By the second day, rain had softened the alley. The tire marks smudged into plain mud. The search unit logged the loss and moved on. The phone log note stayed a note. Proof of life and direction of travel, the two anchors of any early timeline, remained unknown. Inside the station, the loudest theory took the lead: a relationship dispute. Detectives split into interview teams and leaned hard on the boyfriend and the colleague from the courthouse. That focus ate up time, attention, and public trust. The hotline rang. People called in with sightings, rumors, and fear. A clerk wrote tip notes on paper forms and put them in a tray. There was no system to rank tips by time, proximity, or detail. There was no callback protocol to keep witnesses engaged. A few callers never heard from anyone again. When a case looks like it's being ignored, tips stop coming. They did.
By week 2, the investigation had a shape that the public could see. The boyfriend became the front page. The colleague's name drifted into headlines. Reporters asked about fights, secrets, and motives of the heart. The questions made for easy copy. They did not find a car. They did not explain a ramp. They did not account for a white van with a magnet sign that a retired clerk would remember. Could the first days have gone differently? Yes. A quick call to the phone company might have tied the 8:15 p.m. payphone to a specific corner. A same-day visit to Riverview Marina might have caught a fresh memory or a paper slip before it vanished into a drawer. A basic query to local tow and auto glass shops might have flagged a company name to after-hours movement. Incredible of those things happened in time. This isn't guesswork. It's a record of choices. Officers photographed tire marks but didn't preserve the soil. They logged a payphone call but didn't trace the booth. They walked parks but didn't roll to the ramp. They focused on romance over routine. They worked hard, but they worked the wrong list. By the end of 6 weeks, momentum was gone. The Oldsmobile was still missing. The river was still unchecked in any formal way. The Marina's handwritten slips were still wherever the clerk left them. The payphone record was still in a binder. The case that might have turned on water and paper instead turned on rumor and headlines. The file slid into a drawer with a date stamp and a thin stack of reports. The public felt it. People in Tulsa argued in grocery lines about who did what. Some said Julia left by choice. Others said the boyfriend or the colleague must be something. Few asked about the river because the police never made it a priority. The silence around the ramp became part of the story. It should have been part of the search.
What happened next followed a familiar pattern. Leads dried up. Witnesses lost interest. The family kept calling. The department kept saying they were open to new information. The map grids were packed away. The canine went back to regular duty. And somewhere within that 10-mile circle, a car sat under cold water, holding a ticket that would have changed everything if it had been pulled in those first days. This is the truth of the initial search. It was earnest. It was broad. It was also slow where it needed speed, and narrow where it needed range. The errors weren't dramatic. They were ordinary. They were enough. When we pick up the story in the next part, the spotlight turns to suspect number 1, Mark Bennett. We'll walk his timeline, test his alibi, and see how public pressure turned a man with receipts from Dallas into Tulsa's favorite suspect, and how that focus helped push the real trail even further into the dark. Mark Bennett was 38 years old in 1985. He worked as a civil project manager for Red River Engineering, a firm handling road and bridge projects across Oklahoma and Texas. Colleagues described him as steady, methodical, a man who lived by schedules and blueprints. He wasn't flashy, but he was reliable. He met Julia Carter in late 1984 through mutual friends. The relationship moved quickly. Within a year, they were serious enough to talk about living together. Friends thought Julia had finally found stability after her divorce. To many, Mark looked like a safe choice. A professional, good income, no criminal past. But behind closed doors, there were cracks. Neighbors on East Pine Street remembered heated arguments spilling out into the night. The topic was always the same: their future. Julia wanted clarity. Mark hesitated. One neighbor later told police, "I heard her voice. She was saying, 'You either move in or we're done.' He said, 'You're pushing too hard.' It got loud enough I almost knocked on the door." Caleb, Julia's son, didn't remember the words but recalled the tension. He said he often went upstairs early when Mark was over because the grown-up talk was too sharp. By early October 1985, rumors spread that Mark was dragging his feet. Some thought he didn't want the responsibility of raising another man's child. Others believed he was considering ending things before the holidays. That's why, when Julia disappeared, many people immediately looked to him. But the timeline told a different story. On October 17th, Mark drove to Dallas for a scheduled site inspection. He checked into a hotel near downtown. The invoice showed his stay from October 17th through October 19th. On the evening of October 18th, the night Julia vanished, he parked his car at 8:42 p.m. in a Reunion District garage. The parking stub carried the timestamp. 2 co-workers confirmed they met him for dinner at a steakhouse from 7:15 until 9:30. They said he looked relaxed, ordered a drink, and talked about upcoming projects. The restaurant was crowded. Waitstaff remembered him too. Dallas was 250 miles from Tulsa. The drive was at least 4 hours one way. The picture forming in the public's mind was not of a grieving partner, but of a man who might have had a motive. The media poured fuel on it. Local tabloids ran headlines like "Boyfriend in Dallas" or a cover story. The image of a successful attorney and her hesitant boyfriend made for sensational copy. Reporters speculated that Julia may have confronted him with an ultimatum and that he snapped. Mark's career collapsed almost overnight. Red River Engineering put him on unpaid leave. A major client pulled out of a contract, citing concerns about ongoing investigation. By early 1986, he had to leave Tulsa. He moved to Plano, Texas to start over. His reputation never recovered. But what really haunted him were the whispers. For the next 20 years, whenever Julia Carter's case was mentioned, his name came first. People lowered their voices and said, "That was the boyfriend, right?" Even though police had no physical evidence, no motive strong enough, and an alibi that checked out, he was branded guilty in the court of public opinion. The strain reached Julia's family, too. Her mother, Evelyn, believed Mark had nothing to do with it. She pointed to the Dallas alibi as solid. But Julia's sister admitted she was never sure. She told a reporter, "I wanted to believe him, but when a woman disappears after fighting with her boyfriend, you don't forget that."
Caleb, Julia's son, lived under the shadow of those doubts. At school, other kids repeated what they heard at home. He grew up hearing that maybe his mother's boyfriend killed her. And yet, the evidence still stood. The hotel records, the dinner witnesses, the parking stub, the miles of road between Dallas and Tulsa. Investigators said it didn't add up for Mark to be the killer. Still, one detail kept people talking. In the weeks before Julia vanished, she confided to a friend that Mark was pressuring her to slow down. She wanted commitment, he wanted space. Their last known argument happened in her kitchen, early October. A friend recalled Julia's words. "He says he's not ready, but I won't wait forever." That clash, commitment versus hesitation, became the emotional hook for suspicion. If arguments were that sharp, who's to say they didn't?
Then came 2010. After 25 years of suspicion, the Cold Case Unit announced new evidence pointing to another man entirely, Harold Pike. For the first time, police said publicly that Mark Bennett had nothing to do with Julia's disappearance. He was cleared. Mark attended the memorial that spring, hair silver now, face worn. He stood before the plaque at Riverview, Marina, and said only one sentence. 25 years in the dark finally ends. For him, the truth came too late to save his reputation, his career, or the years he lost to suspicion. But for Julia Carter's story, his chapter was essential. He embodied the cost of a flawed investigation, where the easiest target bore the heaviest burden. With Mark finally cleared, investigators and the public turned to another name, another life upended by suspicion. Thomas Reed, Julia's colleague and courtroom adversary. His story would take the case deeper into controversy and prolong the mystery for decades. Thomas Reed was 41 years old in 1985. He worked as an assistant prosecutor at the Tulsa County DA's office. Ambitious, polished, competitive in court, he had built a reputation for chasing narcotics and fraud cases with a sharp tongue. Colleagues knew him as a man who cared deeply about his image, the kind who pressed his suits twice and never missed a chance to outshine others in the courtroom. He drove a silver mid-size sedan, a common car at the time, but one that would later raise questions. Reed and Julia Carter crossed paths often. She defended the accused. He prosecuted them. Their encounters were not polite debates. They clashed, loudly, in front of judges, juries, and clerks. Witnesses remembered sparks in those hearings. 2 weeks before her disappearance, the two went head-to-head in a suppression hearing. Reed cut her off mid-sentence, calling her motion a stunt. Julia snapped back. "Then meet the facts." The judge had to intervene, warning both to keep it professional. It wasn't personal on paper, but anyone in the room could feel the hostility. That rivalry fueled whispers. In the courthouse, rumor worked faster than ever. When Julia vanished on October 18th, Reed's alibi was simple. He said he was home, alone, watching Game 3 of the 1985 World Series. First pitch at 7 p.m., game ending around 10:15. No guests, no calls from friends, no receipts from food delivery. Just his word. That lack of outside confirmation left a hole. At the same time, a witness had reported seeing a light-colored coupe near North Denver Avenue around 9:15 that night. It was vague, just a flash of a car, but Reed happened to own a silver sedan. Police couldn't prove it was his, but they couldn't rule it out either. Detectives interviewed Reed 3 times. The first time he came in alone, cooperative, answering each question carefully. By the second round, he brought a lawyer. His answers stayed the same, but his tone shifted, more cautious, more guarded.
He denied any romantic link to Julia. He denied being near her home. He repeated his story, at home, watching the game, alone. Officers searched his office and his house. They found no incriminating evidence. His car showed no fresh damage, no signs it had been used to haul anything unusual. No Marina tickets, no river maps, no receipts from towing companies. His phone record showed no calls to Julia that night, and no unusual activity. Still, suspicion stuck. The case had stalled, and the turn leaned in jealousy. Reed fit the narrative. He was her professional rival, rumored confidant, and a man with an alibi no one else could vouch for. In the absence of hard evidence, that made him dangerous in the public eye. Local newspapers jumped on the angle. Headlines asked if the polished prosecutor knew more than he admitted. Editorials speculated about a courthouse affair turned dark. Talk radio and paint apology of late-night deals gone wrong. Once Mark Bennett's alibi in Dallas looked firm, the fallout came quickly. The DA's office played him on paid administrative leave, citing the need to preserve public trust. His promotion to senior assistant DA stopped cold. An internal memo reminded about avoiding impropriety with defense attorneys.
Still, the damage was done. Reed's marriage fractured under the weight of the rumors. By the late 1980s, he was separated and eventually divorced. His bar status remained intact, but his career plateaued. He kept practicing, but he would never climb higher. For decades, the suspicion lingered. When Julia's name appeared in the papers each October under unsolved cases, Reed's name often followed. He lived quietly, avoiding interviews, refusing to participate in documentaries. To some, that silence was another sign of guilt. Everything changed in 2007. Julia's car was pulled from the Arkansas River, a discovery that shifted the narrative. When the Marina ticket dated 10:05 p.m. surfaced, Reed's timeline no longer mattered. In 2010, when the Marina clerk's ledger showed a white van tied to Pike Auto Glass Towing, suspicion finally moved away from him. The evidence pointed in a new direction, and Reed's name was formally cleared. By then, the damage was irreversible. His career was long gone, his reputation shredded. At a press conference in 2010, the DA issued an apology, acknowledging the years of speculation and the harm caused by focusing too narrowly on personal angles. A courthouse colleague, when asked years later, put it plainly. They argued hard in court. That was the job. I never saw anything more. Reed never publicly celebrated his clearance. He stayed out of sight, living quietly, his story serving as a reminder of what suspicion without evidence can do. With Mark Bennett and Thomas Reed both ruled out, the case had nowhere left to go. Leads dried up. Witnesses aged. The Oldsmobile remained missing, and the trail turned cold. For more than 2 decades, Julia Carter's file gathered dust, nearly disappearing with her. That silence would define the next 20 years of the case, until the Arkansas River gave up its secret and changed the investigation forever. The months after Julia Carter's disappearance passed without answers. By early 1986, detectives had no suspects who could be tied to the scene. No car, no physical evidence that led anywhere. The case was formally reclassified as missing person. For the family, silence was unbearable. Evelyn Carter, Julia's mother, refused to let her daughter's name fade. Every year she held a small memorial at Sand Springs. At first, friends and colleagues came, but over time the crowd thinned. By the mid-1990s, it was often just Evelyn, standing alone with a candle, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter did not leave by choice. Caleb, Julia's son, grew up under a cloud. At school, children whispered that his mother had abandoned him. Some teachers treated him cautiously, not sure whether to comfort or avoid the subject. The family itself fractured. Certain relatives believed Julia had been murdered. Others quietly wondered if she had decided to walk away from the life she had built. Mark Bennett, Julia's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance, lived with the burden of suspicion. Though his Dallas alibi had been checked and confirmed, he could not escape the whispers. Each time he returned to Tulsa, he heard people mutter at diners and gas stations. His career in Texas survived only at a modest level. Major clients backed away, unwilling to be tied to his name. Mark kept the hotel receipts, parking stubs, and witness statements in a file, always ready to defend himself. But in truth, no one wanted to hear evidence anymore. The shadow of doubt was stronger than the facts. Thomas Reed, the prosecutor and colleague who had clashed with Julia in court, saw his life unravel in a slower, more punishing way. He was never charged, never formally accused, but the whispers destroyed him. His wife left, colleagues pulled back, and his career stalled. He remained at the DA's office, but knew promotion was out of reach. To the public, he was the secret lover of Julia Carter, a label that was never proven, but stuck for decades. In social settings, people stared. In the courthouse, people lowered their voices when he walked past. Reed lived with suspicion as a permanent shadow. Time worked against the investigation in other ways. Witnesses who might have clarified details slipped away. The pedestrian who saw a light-colored coupe near Julia's neighborhood in the 1990s brought breakthroughs in DNA testing. Old cold cases across the country were solved with hair samples, blood stains, and cigarette butts. Families gained closure. But for the Carter case, there was nothing to test. Julia's car was gone. No personal items were recovered from a crime scene. No hair or blood had ever been collected. Each year, more and more detectives concluded that her case was beyond saving. The absence of evidence became the story itself. As years passed, media coverage dwindled. The case that once made front-page headlines in Tulsa shrank to a footnote. Local radio stations stopped mentioning anniversaries. National true crime programs ignored it because there was no arc, no resolution. By the early 2000s, Julia Carter's disappearance was rarely spoken about beyond a few lines in community papers and occasional podcasts run by amateurs. For most of Tulsa, it was an old ghost story. But for the family, the pain never dimmed. Caleb grew into adulthood still carrying questions. He tried to build a life, but his mother's absence followed him. Each birthday, each graduation, every milestone carried the sting of uncertainty. Evelyn, aging into her 70s, continued to write letters to the Tulsa Police Department, demanding they re-examine the case. She filed public records requests. She clipped newspaper stories of other cold cases that were solved, sending them to investigators as a plea not to forget Julia. Most of the time, her letters went unanswered. Two men, wrongly suspected for decades, carried their own burdens. Mark Bennett lived quietly in Plano, Texas, but avoided interviews and public gatherings. He knew that no matter how often he showed his hotel receipt, someone would always doubt him. Thomas Reed carried the heavier weight of reputation. Though he was eventually allowed to keep his bar license, he never returned to prominence. By the early 2000s, he was known as a cautionary tale about rumors destroying careers. Both men lived their lives under a cloud they could not clear. The case drifted into darkness. Files gathered dust in the police archive. Detectives retired. Younger officers barely recognized the name Julie. For more than 2 decades, no one could answer. Hope faded. The Carter family lived with silence. The accused men lived with suspicion. And Tulsa carried on, with the memory of Julia's disappearance fading into a minor story from the past. But fate had one more twist. In the summer of 2007, the Arkansas River dropped to a record low. Construction crews working near the Riverview area dredged the riverbed. Buried in mud and rust was the skeleton of a car. The frame was barely recognizable, eaten by water and time. But the VIN number still told its story. It was Julia Carter's Oldsmobile. After 22 years, her car had surfaced from the river. The dead years were over. The investigation, long thought impossible to revive, suddenly had a new path forward. The disappearance of Julia Carter quickly faded from the headlines. By 1986, the Tulsa Police Department had already moved on. In annual reports, her case was reduced to a single line under Unsolved Missing Persons. No new leads, no progress, no answers. For the detectives who worked it, it was another file in a cabinet. For her family, it was a wound that never closed. Her mother, Evelyn, refused to let the city forget. Every October, she lit candles at Sand Springs, keeping Julia's name alive in small community gatherings. Some years, only a handful of people showed up. Other years, the family stood alone in silence, surrounded by photographs and fading newspaper clippings. For Evelyn, the ritual was an act of defiance. She would not let her daughter vanish completely. But the rumors never stopped. Caleb, Julia's only son, was 11 when his mother disappeared. He grew up in a neighborhood where whispers carried faster than facts. Classmates repeated what their parents said at dinner tables. Your mom ran away with a man. She didn't want you anymore. No matter how many times Evelyn insisted otherwise, the boy lived under the shadow of those cruel stories. Meanwhile, suspicion hardened around 2 men. Mark Bennett, Julia's boyfriend, had an alibi. He was in Dallas that weekend, staying at a hotel with receipts to prove it. But the court of public opinion didn't care. Neighbors remembered hearing arguments about marriage weeks before Julia vanished. Newspapers ran headlines. The second man, Thomas Reed, was a colleague at the courthouse, a prosecutor, respected in legal circles, but rumored to be too close to Julia outside the courtroom. When investigators searched his office and home, they found nothing incriminating. Still, the rumors stuck. He told police he had been home watching the World Series the night Julia vanished, but no one could confirm it. His wife filed for divorce. His chances for promotion disappeared. By the early 1990s, he was seen as the colleague who knew more than he admitted. The stain followed him everywhere. Through the late 80s and into the 90s, nothing changed. No car, no body, no evidence. The advances in forensic science that helped solve other cold cases did nothing here. There were no fingerprints to test, no blood samples preserved. No items from the scene that could be sent to a lab. Julia's case was frozen in time. The media only remembered when space needed filling. In 1992, a local TV special listed Unsolved Oklahoma Mysteries, and Julia's picture appeared for less than 30 seconds. By then, the narrative had shifted. She was no longer a respected attorney who vanished. She was a rumor, a woman who might have walked out on her life. Reporters often linked her name back to Mark or Tom, recycling the same speculation that had ruined their reputations. By the mid-1990s, Caleb was in high school. He had learned to keep his mother's name out of conversations. But the damage was done. Friends repeated the gossip they heard at home. "Your mom just ran off, right?" The boy carried that weight into adulthood. For him, Every year that passed without answers deepened the silence. In 1996, something happened that would later prove critical, though no one realized it at the time. Harold "Hal" Pike, the man who truly held the key to Julia's disappearance, died in a trucking accident. His name was never connected to her case. No detective ever interviewed him. When he died, any chance of holding him accountable in a courtroom died with him. By the late 1990s, forensic DNA testing had exploded across the country. Old evidence boxes were reopened, and dozens of cold cases were solved. Families finally got closure after decades of waiting. But Julia's case was not one of them. With no vehicle, no remains, and nothing physical saved from the scene, there was nothing to test. The technology that could have changed everything was useless here. For Julia's family, watching other families get justice only deepened the despair. From 2001 onward, Tulsa's newly formed cold case unit began reviewing files. Detectives worked through unsolved murders, prioritizing those with preserved evidence. Julia's disappearance sat on a shelf. Without leads or physical proof, her file ranked low. Between 2001 and 2006, no one in the unit touched her box of papers. It was just another stack of files in storage, dusty and forgotten. For Mark Bennett, the years dragged on with bitterness. He rebuilt a modest life in Texas, but suspicion trailed him. He stopped correcting people when they asked about Julia. He knew most had already decided he was guilty. Tom Reed fared no better. He lived with a ruined career, surviving on smaller legal work, watching his marriage dissolve, carrying the label of the other suspect that never went away. Both men lost everything without ever being charged. For Evelyn, the passage of time was unbearable. She spent every year pressing the police for updates, always receiving the same answer: no new leads. By the early 2000s, she was in her late 70s. She feared she would die without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. And for Caleb, now a grown man, in the summer of 2007, drought hit Oklahoma hard. The Arkansas River shrank to levels not seen in years. Mud banks stretched out, cracked by the sun. Workers dredging near Riverview boat ramp noticed the shape of metal buried in the silt. At first it looked like debris, another piece of junk pulled in by the current. But the outline was wrong. It had curves, doors, the roofline of a car. They called Tulsa police. When the rusted shell was pulled from the river, investigators crowded around. The VIN plate, almost unreadable under corrosion, still matched one name: Julia M. Carter. Her Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, missing since October 18, 1985, had been lying under the river for 22 years. The car was a ruin. The seats were shredded, metal frames poked through rotted cushions. There was no usable DNA, no fingerprints, no clean surfaces to test. The driver's side door was locked. The gearshift sat in drive. The front seat was folded halfway down as if moved quickly. There was no handbag, no keys, no evidence of a struggle inside. Just silence, preserved in rust. The discovery should have brought answers, but it only deepened the questions. In the trunk, investigators found a leather folder with court papers, the kind Julia carried every day to trial. They found her wallet, still holding her bar ID and driver's license. A few faded receipts remained. There was no cash. Whoever had left the car there had wanted the world to believe Julia had vanished, but had left the most important things untouched. And then there was the small rectangle of paper that changed everything. A parking stub. Faded, smudged, nearly falling apart, it showed a handwritten entry. Riverview, Marina. Date: October 18th, 1985. Time: 10:05 p.m. The number of the toll booth clerk barely visible under blurred ink. That ticket pulled the case back to life. Detectives tracked down the man who once owned the Marina. He was long retired, in his 80s now, but he still remembered that night. The cold case unit began checking every possible link. They dug through hotel receipts, gas purchases, parking stubs from October 18, 1985. They confirmed again that Mark Bennett had been in Dallas. They confirmed that Tom Reed had not left his house that night, at least according to utility records and neighbors. Neither man fit the van. The case, for the first time in 20 years, pointed away from the people Julia knew best. Detectives then shifted to another angle. Who else had business with Julia? Who had reason to cross her? They compiled lists of contractors and small businesses that had worked inside Tulsa County Courthouse in the mid-1980s. Glass repairmen, tow truck drivers, maintenance crews, men who drove white vans. They issued requests to every marina, every boat ramp, every parking lot in Tulsa County, asking if old ledgers, stubs, or receipts from the 1980s had been preserved. Most had long been thrown out, but they tried anyway. They published notices in local papers, urging anyone with records, receipts, or notes from October 1985 to step forward. They even asked residents to check garages, attics, and storage boxes for forgotten paperwork. The team also recreated Julia's last possible route. Using maps from 1985, they plotted the drive from her house on Pine Street to Riverview Marina. It was only 12 minutes, with no traffic. They checked where payphones had been located along that route, comparing them with the 8:15 p.m. call Julia had received at home that night. That call, never traced in 1985, now seemed tied to the van and the Marina. In late 2007, the press caught wind of the discovery. Headlines read, "Lawyer's car pulled from river after 22 years." For the first time, suspicion shifted. The story no longer focused on Mark or Tom. Instead, it was about the mysterious white van and the slip of paper found in the trunk. Local news crews filmed at the Marina. Families gathered to pray by the water. Evelyn Carter and her grandson Caleb stood in the crowd, holding hands, as cameras rolled. The case was moving again. Between 2008 and 2009, detectives widened their search. They tracked down former Marina staff, The discovery of the car had not solved the mystery, but it had broken the 20-year silence. For the first time since Julia vanished, investigators had direction. They had a time, a place, and a vehicle, and most of all, they had hope. By 2009, the public had begun asking a new question. If Julia's car had been hidden in the river by a man in a white van, who was he? And why had no one looked for him before? The reopening of the case did not clear the pain of 2 decades. It did not erase the damage done to Mark and Tom, but it forced Tulsa to admit something that had been ignored for too long. They might have been wrong all along. The river had given up the car. The stub had given up a time. And now the search was closing in on the man who drove that white van into the dark. In March 2010, the case that had haunted Tulsa for 25 years finally broke open. It started not in a police station or a courthouse, but in the attic of a former Marina clerk. While cleaning out old boxes, he found a ledger. Faded, dusty, but intact. He flipped through the pages and stopped at October 18, 1985. There, in his own handwriting, were 5 words: "White van, cash, 10:12 p.m." He called the Tulsa Police Department and handed it over. Investigators opened the book and felt the weight of what they were holding. For decades, the absence of hard records had crippled the case. Now here was proof written the very night Julia Carter disappeared. The ledger didn't stand alone. The clerk remembered the scene with surprising clarity. He recalled a white van pulling up late that night, a man paying in cash, and the logo painted on the side: Pike Glass Tow. That detail had never been reported publicly. It was a memory untainted by rumor, locked in his mind since the night he scribbled the note. Tulsa PD moved fast. They searched old business registrations. Records confirmed that Pike Auto Glass Towing operated in Tulsa from the early 1980s until it suddenly closed in 1986. The owner was Harold "Hal" Pike, 44 years old in 1985. His name had never surfaced in the original. Investigators went back to the phone records from the night Julia vanished. At 8:15 p.m., a brief call came into her house from a payphone. In 1985, police had logged it, but never pursued it. Now it looked different. Pike was known for using payphones, often near the Marina, to avoid leaving a trail. That call fit his pattern. The timeline was finally coming together. The parking stub found in Julia's trunk showed 10:05 p.m. at Riverview, Marina. The ledger, written independently by the clerk, showed a white van at 10:12 p.m. The two entries aligned almost perfectly. Julia's car and Pike's van had been at the same ramp at the same time. The Marina owner, now in his 80s, repeated what he had said in 2007. A middle-aged man, stocky build, paying in cash, rushing away in a white work van. The retired clerk backed it up. 2 witnesses, 2 records, both pointing to the same man. The cold case unit pieced it together like a chain. The phone call at 8:15, the van at the Marina just after 10, Julia's car sinking into the Arkansas River, the ledger linking it to Pike Glass Tow, and the courthouse dispute giving motive. For the first time in 25 years, the evidence formed a clear path. But there was a catch. Harold Pike had been dead since 1996. He had died in a trucking accident on a highway outside Oklahoma City. A crash that claimed his life long before investigators ever thought to look at him. The man at the center of it all was gone. Still, the cold case unit pressed forward. They reviewed every surviving record of Pike's business, old invoices, vehicle registrations, witness statements from former employees. It all fit the profile. He drove white vans with his company's name painted on the side. He often worked late. He had a history of anger when challenged. He was known to take cash, avoid receipts, and vanish from jobs. In April 2010, Tulsa PD made it official. They announced that Harold "Half" Pike was the prime suspect in the disappearance and presumed murder of Julia Carter. They declared that Mark Bennett and Tom Reed, the 2 men who... The cold case unit called it a turning point. The lesson was clear. Never dismiss paper trails, however small. A faded stub, a forgotten ledger, the testimony of a clerk who remembered a logo. These had cracked a case that years of speculation and interviews could not. The department changed its protocols, requiring marinas, parking lots, and ramps to keep logs for at least 10 years. And they urged investigators to search waterways immediately in future missing person cases. For Mark Bennett, it was vindication after 25 years of whispers. He had lost his career, his home, and his reputation. Now the record showed he had told the truth all along. For Tom Reed, the apology came too late to save his marriage or his career, but at least the stain of suspicion was lifted. For Evelyn and Caleb, the news was bittersweet.
They finally knew who had taken Julia, but they also knew justice had died with him 14 years earlier. The real breakthrough had not come from science, DNA, or technology. It came from paper. A stub left in a car, a note left in a ledger, two scraps of evidence that survived the river and the decades. And when combined, they told the truth. Julia Carter's fate was sealed not by love or betrayal, but by a man named Harold Pike, and by a river that hid her story for 25 years. In May 2010, the Tulsa Police Department stood before cameras and delivered the words that had been delayed for 25 years. They named Harold Hal Pike as the prime suspect in the disappearance and murder of Julia Carter. And they cleared the two men who had lived under suspicion for decades. Mark Bennett and Thomas Reed were officially declared innocent.
The press conference was broadcast live. Families gathered around televisions. Reporters filled notepads with quotes. For the first time, the truth had a name, and the lies that had shadowed two men were undone. At Riverview Marina, the site where Julia's car had been recovered, the Carter family held a memorial. Friends, relatives, and members of the community stood by the water. They placed flowers near a small plaque of bronze engraved with Julia's name, a marker for a woman whose life had been stolen and whose story had been buried in the river for so long. Mark Bennett, now gray-haired, stepped up to speak. For years he had been whispered about in coffee shops, condemned in headlines, judged without trial. That day he looked out at the crowd and said only one thing. 25 years in the dark finally ends. The words carried both relief and sorrow. He had been vindicated, but the damage to his life could never be erased. Thomas Reed was also there, a former prosecutor who had once stood tall in courtrooms, now a man whose career had collapsed under rumor. He had lost his marriage, lost promotions, lost the respect of colleagues. In 2010, the bar reinstated his license, but there was no position waiting for him, no courtroom to return to. He had been proven innocent, but his life had been broken in the process. The community, too, was forced to confront its mistakes. Neighbors who had once spread gossip now expressed regret. People admitted they had believed the rumors, that they had looked at Mark and Tom with suspicion. The newspapers ran long features about the innocent suspects, reflecting on the damage caused by decades of misplaced doubt. The city government responded quickly. Tulsa announced new rules requiring marinas, boat ramps, and parking operators to preserve logs and receipts for at least 10 years. What had once been considered disposable scraps of paper were now recognized as vital pieces of potential evidence. The cold case unit also changed its playbook. From that day forward, every missing person investigation near water would automatically include searches of nearby ramps, marinas, and shorelines. No assumption, no shortcut, no bias about motive would replace a thorough search. Julia's case had shown how one overlooked boat ramp had stalled justice for 25 years. National media seized on the story. They called it the Marina ticket case. For viewers across the country, it became an example of how a single overlooked ticket and a forgotten ledger could hold the key to the truth. Documentaries and podcasts dissected the investigation, pointing out how early bias toward personal motives had blinded detectives to other possibilities. Police academies soon included the case in their training programs. Recruits studied how public pressure and rumor had steered investigators down the wrong path. They learned to check every lead, preserve every record, and avoid assuming that affairs of the heart explained every disappearance. Julia's file became a cautionary tale about the cost of tunnel vision. For Julia's son Caleb, now 36, The announcement was deeply personal. He had spent his childhood hearing whispers that his mother had abandoned him. For the first time, police stood at a podium and declared publicly that she had not walked away. She had been a victim of violence, not a runaway. For him, that acknowledgement was a release from a lifetime of doubt. Yet even with the truth revealed, the justice system could not deliver its final step. Harold Pike had died in 1996, 14 years before the evidence connected him to the crime. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no guilty verdict read in a courtroom. For Evelyn, Julia's mother, and for Caleb, that reality was crushing. They had names and proof, but no formal justice. Still, the legacy of the case was not just the correction of a false narrative. It was a reminder of endurance. A mother who refused to let her daughter be forgotten. A son who lived through rumor and finally heard the truth. Two men who carried suspicion but never stopped insisting on their innocence. And a police unit that learned too late the cost of overlooking the ordinary. Justice in its purest form was impossible. The guilty man was beyond reach. But history delivered what the courts could not. Julia Carter was vindicated, her memory restored, and the innocent were cleared. The story of Julia Carter's disappearance stands as a warning, a reminder that truth can be delayed but not erased, that investigations must be wide, careful, and free from bias, and that sometimes all it takes is a stub of paper, a line in a ledger, or a witness who remembers, to break the silence of decades. If this story has moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, and keep these lessons alive. And if you know of an unsolved case, if you hold a detail you think might matter, even if it feels small, bring it forward. Because the next scrap of paper, the next memory, could be the one that finally delivers the truth.